William Evans Fellow, Professor Nathan Hughes. Nathan is a Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield. His research examines the relationship between childhood neurodevelopmental impairment and engagement with the youth justice system. This has involved examining levels of impairment among youth justice populations, utilising neuroscience and developmental sciences to consider the mechanisms that increase risk of offending and critical reflection on the operations of the youth justice system that might discriminate against and therefore criminalise disability. Nathan's interdisciplinarity is evidenced through publications in journals related to criminology, social policy, adolescent health, neuropsychology and developmental science, as well as a range of practice-focused journals. His publications include articles in discipline-leading journals such as Lancet Psychiatry and the Journal of Child Psychiatry and Psychology. He's lead author of a commissioned article in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health that will be published later this year, examining global patterns of health determinants of justice involvement for adolescents, the topic that Nathan will talk on today. His publications have also included a series of reports and papers that have achieved significant policy and practice impact. Most notably, Nobody Made the Connection, a review of the prevalence of neurodevelopmental disorders among young people in custody. This research has had a significant impact in New Zealand, being attributed by Andrew Beecroft, who was the Principal Youth Court Justice and is now the Children's Commissioner, as underpinning reform of youth court processes. Nathan's substantive impact on national and international policy debates is also illustrated by an invitation through the New Zealand Human Rights Commission to address the United Nations Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the UN headquarters in New York, and being called to give oral evidence to the UK Parliamentary Justice Select Committee inquiry into young adults in the criminal justice system. And this evidence is heavily cited in subsequent reports and ongoing debates. He has a sustained record of research from key academic research agencies, as well as income from multiple government departments, quasi-government organisations, and leading charities in the field of social policy and criminal justice. A recent prestigious European Commission Marie Curie Research Fellowship included 2 years based at the School of Government at the University of Melbourne and the Centre for Adolescent Health and the Australian Centre for Child Neuropsychology Studies at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And Nathan retains honorary appointments at both those institutions. So, welcome Nathan. Thank you for coming to speak to us today.
I'll pause a moment. Yeah, okay. Something else finished at 10:30. Okay, fantastic. We'll go. Okay, thanks very much for coming, everyone. Just as a very brief recap of that for people that have just joined in with the introduction. So my background is in the social sciences. My particular interests are around youth justice and criminal justice. And most recently, my research has been about trying to make sense of how in that kind of criminal justice and youth justice space, we can learn from the expertise of people like yourselves and health sciences through the neurosciences. So try to think about how the emerging understandings there can really help us to improve real flaws in our practice in the youth justice space. And this paper that I'm going to give today is part of a series that's been commissioned by the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health as part of what you might be aware of a growing emphasis in the Lancet kind of family of journals on adolescent health, which they've kind of recognised recently as a real gap in terms of sort of global thinking about health policy and practice. So it's part of a series. There's a parallel paper to this one on health following detention, kind of mortality and morbidity after experience of criminal justice, that's being led by colleagues at the University of Melbourne. I should start by acknowledging the impressive list of co-authors who've helped me draw this together, and I'll say something about some of their expertise as we go. I also just want to say before we start that this is a paper that's about to be submitted, so I'm really, really keen to hear the critiques now rather than wait for this anonymous peer review process to get them all. So please, there will be some things, and I'll highlight some things that I would really welcome your critiques, however harsh. And also I'm very keen, given my interest, I'm very keen to provoke some comments and reflections from you guys in terms of your own expertise. And in particular, I'm going to end with a few questions about the New Zealand context that I'd really be keen to hear from you on. So hopefully questions at the end, but also just comments and reflections would be really helpful too. But I should say something first, I guess. So yeah, so as we probably all now know well, adolescence is a really key dynamic phase of maturation that's shaped through interaction with the social environment, enabling the acquisition of a whole range of kind of complex cognitive, social and emotional abilities that we need to make this kind of transition into adulthood. In particular, we increasingly know about the neurological development that's taking place in this period. So rather than kind of prior assumptions that everything was done by the kind of early teenage years, there's now much more of an understanding that we're still developing, we're still maturing neurologically during this period. And we know that this development is underpinned by the health and well-being that we experience in childhood and adolescence. And so the range of things I'm going to talk about today, childhood neurodevelopmental disability, mental health difficulties, experience of adversity, experiences of trauma, are all really key to the to the development that's taking place at this point. We also know that adolescence is a really critical period in terms of the development of delinquency and antisocial behaviour across the life course. And the onset of delinquency typically occurs in the adolescence years, and there's a peak rate in early adulthood, essentially. Many of you will be familiar with this is the kind of ubiquitous age crime curve, which is seen as being a kind of consistent finding across various national contexts. This particular example comes from Australia. I couldn't find a New Zealand one, so it's as close as I could get. But shows you a peak in both violent and non-violent offending between the ages of about 15 and 21, and then a dramatic sort of drop-off. So we know that there's a significant proportion, a significant number of young people who are becoming involved in the criminal justice system. We also know that, importantly, one of the best predictors for kind of adult criminality is early onset of that criminality. So the greater the risk of more persistent and serious criminal careers, the earlier the offending starts. We also know that involvement in the criminal justice system is not necessarily the offending itself, but the involvement in the criminal justice system in this period can have real consequences for those developmental milestones and that maturation that we're talking about, particularly around access to education and employment opportunities. So longitudinal studies have shown that this atypical adolescent health and development that's characterised by difficulties in cognitive or emotional or neuropsychological functioning have significant influences on those sort of trends that we're looking at. And the Christchurch study and the Dunedin study have obviously been kind of crucial in our understandings of these trajectories. However, I would argue that our understandings of this have been kind of fractured across disciplines. And in my own discipline, in criminology, we only really understand these kind of complex health and developmental difficulties, impairments, challenges as being kind of specific and discrete risk factors. So we plug them into our research as though they were individual things that we can isolate, as opposed to understanding the kind of complexity of experience that comes with that for a young person. And as I say, what's more, it's actually spread across disciplines. So our aim with this body of work is to draw together these disparate bodies of evidence and to do so to address these kind of key aims. So firstly, to identify the health and the related social experiences that are impacting upon adolescent development that then serve as determinants of criminal justice involvement in that part of the life course. To think about how aspects of social disadvantage interact with those health and developmental difficulties, so that they place particular sections of our populations at risk of criminal justice involvement. And then, of course, to reflect on what that might mean for how we might think about better legal policy and practice responses. The additional aim here being to, because it's for the Lancet, they want to think globally, so to think about the extent to which the evidence that we have is kind of consistent across various national contexts, including in this thinking about the emerging evidence that we might have in low and middle income countries, and I'll kind of reflect on that a few times. So something very brief on methods, but I won't bore you with it. But we sought to illustrate the extent of evidence across the widest possible range of topics, and therefore to be kind of inclusive of research from various global regions, as I said. And so our search strategy reflects that, and its attempt to be inclusive rather than to be too rigid in our criteria or in our searches. So we've used the means that we think will get us to the evidence that we might not otherwise identify, particularly in those low and middle income contexts. So no restrictions on year of publication, no restrictions on less restrictions on the kind of the quality of evidence that we might draw on. But given that, and given the inconsistency in evidence, the way that we present this is as a kind of propositional approach. So we try not to be too kind of deterministic in what we're saying, and it'd be good to get your reflections on that. Okay. So I'm going to present to you the kind of three kind of key propositions that our paper argues. The first one is the main one, and we'll take the kind of the bulk of the time, and then a couple of others to reflect on. So the first proposition, of course, is that adolescent health and developmental difficulties serve as important determinants of criminal justice involvement. And there are a disparate range of influences on adolescent development that we would argue increases the risk of involvement in the criminal justice system. And so the following slides illustrate this range of influences from neurodevelopmental disabilities, to traumatic brain injury, mental health difficulties, childhood experiences of trauma and adversity, and trying to make sense of how these kind of influence the trajectories. So we'll start with as the introduction said, the area of research that I'm kind of most personally engaged with, and that's around childhood neurodevelopmental disability. And people will probably be familiar with this term, but it's inclusive of a wide range of conditions beyond those listed here, which manifest early in life and are characterised by a kind of varied combination of functional impairments. And recent research, including some of our own, has established the disproportionate prevalence of a range of these forms of disability among justice-involved young people. For example, young people with a learning or an intellectual disability appear to be overrepresented throughout the system. So compared to general youth population estimates of about 2 to 4%, it would seem that studies of prevalence amongst the youth justice populations range from 7 to 15%, with custodial populations being higher, including the kind of 2 UK studies that bookend this at kind of 27 to 32%. And what's more, 2 surveys of over 18,000 young people in the UK would suggest that conduct disorder is about 6 times more likely among young people with learning disability. Similarly, if we look at ADHD, then rates of 3 to 7% are commonly kind of identified in the general population of young people, but a meta-analysis that reviewed some 25 studies from across various national contexts suggests a rate of 11.7% among incarcerated young people. Similarly, longitudinal studies suggest that childhood ADHD predicts later antisocial behaviour, which again is supported by meta-analysis that sees ADHD as a substantially important predictor. There's also a whole body of research around the particular symptoms of ADHD, so impulsivity, hyperactivity, and the influence that they have, the strong associations with, obviously, with certain forms of criminal behaviour, being indirectly mediated through the kind of notions of conduct disorder and illicit drug use and relationships with peers and so on. One that I know has a high profile in New Zealand at the moment is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And again, similarly, the relationships between particular symptoms and expressions of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and offending are very, very clear. So again, hyperactivity, but also deficits in cognition and executive functioning, the kind of clear links between those challenges and engaging in certain forms of behaviour at certain times. And there's really insufficient evidence, I guess, in this space to make very firm conclusions, but a systematic review that we carried out suggests that there are 4 studies in Canada that have diagnosed FASD in around 11 to 23% of young people in custody, and a more recent study in Western Australia puts the rate even higher at 36%. But it's noteworthy, as you can see there, that there's a real distinction between the rates that all those studies identify in the Aboriginal populations of Canada and Australia compared to the non-Aboriginal populations. So, authors of these studies point out that it's very difficult to kind of separate the experience of FASD from those wider experiences of intergenerational disadvantage and poor access to healthcare and the complexities that we know these populations are facing. Probably the most prevalent form of developmental difficulty among young people in the criminal justice system is traumatic brain injury. And as you'll know, that can result in a whole range of kind of functional difficulties that can impact upon your young person's behaviour, including, again, deficits in cognition, in communication, in impulse control, in empathy, in understanding the emotions of other people. And again, these are repeatedly identified as risk factors for offending. And our recent systematic review suggests that somewhere between 32 and 50% of young people in custody typically report experience of a traumatic brain injury that resulted in a significant loss of consciousness, compared to a broad range, but somewhere between 5 and 24%. And interestingly, as the seriousness of the brain injury increases, then that disparity becomes bigger. However, again, this is the first time I'll say this, and I find myself saying this frequently. All the studies that we have here are undertaken in Australia, in the UK, and in the US. And although we have strong evidence of high rates of TBI in low and middle income countries, we don't have much evidence of the populations that we're interested in here. So a real kind of gap in our understanding. Interesting, I find myself always making this point, it's the point of contention here. Well, we know that those neurodevelopmental disabilities often emerge early in childhood, and they are kind of developmental. Clearly, with traumatic brain injury, it can occur later in life and is often seen to be linked to the sorts of behaviours that I'm concerned with here. But there are some really good population studies that have suggested increased propensity to criminality after that brain injury. In particular, a study of a whole population study in Sweden that compares those who've experienced brain injury with unaffected siblings, and still shows that those who've had a brain injury are twice as likely to go on to offend, taking account of all of the kind of social factors that the sibling might also be experiencing. So similarly, if we look at literature around mental health, there's an extensive evidence of a high prevalence of mental health difficulties among this population. In these contexts, so rates among justice-involved young people appear consistently and considerably higher again than those general population estimates that you can see. So, for example, rates of serious psychiatric disorder among young people in criminal justice custodial institutions in the US range from some 60 to 70% for young men and 60 to 80% for young women, compared to, as you can see, kind of 7 to 12% in comparable general population studies. And this trend is reaffirmed by that same meta-analysis of about 25 studies that I mentioned, including studies in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in Russia, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Spain, which in total incorporates something like 16,750 adolescents, and suggests that around 11% of young men and 29% of young women have a major depressive disorder, or diagnosable kind of depressive disorder. And a similar rate of around 10% in Russia. So really kind of consistent evidence around these rates. And similarly, we can see in some studies the comorbidity of depression and more externalizing disorders. So there's a really interesting set of narratives here as to whether it's depression that leads to the conduct problems or conduct problems that lead to depression, but the kind of the comorbidity in the mix that's going on there is very clear. And the consistent message, whilst the kind of the causal pathways differ in different studies, the consistent message seems to be that when you get the two, there's an amplification of those kind of the conduct problems. That there's something here about the anxiety and depression that's fueling the challenge. Similarly, while the evidence of the association between mental health difficulties and criminal justice involvement in high-income countries, as you would expect, is relatively strong. Again, we've got limited evidence in low and middle-income countries. So there's some evidence. We've got high rates of psychiatric disorders reported in Nigeria compared to matched samples. Similarly in Kenya, but there's actually systematic reviews led by some of my colleagues that identify longitudinal studies related to anxiety and depression in China, Chile, Colombia, and Puerto Rico, none of which show anything more than a weak association between depression and offending in those populations. So there's some complexity here in terms of what's going on in these different contexts for us to reflect on. To move on to a slightly different topic, there's also growing evidence of the potential negative impact of experiences of childhood adversity on sort of long-term neurological development. And recent research posits that the prolonged exposure to toxic stress can disrupt this kind of brain development and the kind of functioning that goes with it, might reduce the ability to regulate impulses, might intensify the kind of physiologic responses to stress, and therefore ultimately increase the likelihood that one will kind of engage in what we might call kind of maladaptive behaviours, so aggression and delinquency included. And in the US and the UK, I don't know about here. Again, I'm interested in your reflections. The dominant framework really for understanding the impact of childhood adversity now on future life outcomes has emerged from this adverse childhood experiences framework. There's a few people nodding, so there's clearly some familiarity with it. And these are studies born out of the US initially, but as I say, now routinely carried out in the UK, that gives this framework of 10 ACEs, as you can see listed there. And a person's score is then measured by counting how many of these ACEs they've experienced. Now, I've got some fairly strong reservations about how this framework has developed and how it's being used and applied in ways that actually the people that developed the framework didn't develop it in order for it to be used to do. But nonetheless, there's a body of research which has emerged from this, which is, in the UK at least, has been really helpful in getting a range of professionals to really think about how adversity is impacting on the populations that they're working with. And so here are some examples of what these studies have shown, again, always in these kind of high-income country contexts. So there's a really well-known study of over 64,000 young people involved in the criminal justice system in the US that suggests that somewhere around 96% have had an experience of adversity. And as you can see, 27% of males and 5% of females have experienced 5 or more ACEs. And as an aside, this is one of the things that one of the reservations I have about this, we've got this magic number of 4 or 5 that now everybody's kind of concerned with and all the criteria are set to. And if you've experienced 3, I'm sorry, that's not adversity enough. Regardless of the kind of qualitative experience of that adversity, it's become a kind of a numbers game. But nonetheless, there's fairly stark evidence that this is important. There's a whole group of studies that have drawn on this Florida juvenile justice system in particular, which are relevant here, which has shown a really increased likelihood once within the system of being maintained in that system, so continuing to offend, being incarcerated, but also earlier engagement, which, as I said earlier, is one of the things that predicts longer term engagement, and also more serious, more violent offences coming from these populations. And again, some really complex mechanisms for us to think about, but there's clearly something here about how the system is engaging in and drawing in people with challenging backgrounds. So, as I say, the ACEs framework has really importantly kind of quantified this strong relationship, but it doesn't really pinpoint the mechanisms whereby this childhood adversity leads to delinquency. And furthermore, whilst the population of adults in 21 countries reporting at least one ACE in childhood is similar in high and high middle and low and lower middle income countries, we've still got really limited evidence on the impact of adversity on criminal behaviour in contexts outside of the high-income countries. Of those various forms of adversity that I kind of listed on that previous slide, the one that gets the most attention is experiences of child maltreatment, experiences of abuse. And in particular, there's a seminal longitudinal study in the US that found that those with official records of maltreatment were more likely than those without such records to be subsequently arrested in adolescence and in adulthood. And this is backed up by a meta-analysis of 33 prospective longitudinal studies that have the total population of nearly 24,000 young people, which again show these real strong correlations between child maltreatment and being picked up by the adolescent criminal justice system. It won't surprise you, I'm sure, to know that final point there, that the reported rates of sexual abuse seem to be particularly high among young women in detention. There seems to be a real link between these experiences of maltreatment in childhood for women and going on to offending behaviours. Okay, so I kind of said this already, but yeah, we have strong evidence and strong focus in the US and the UK and some other places, but very little evidence emerging from other country contexts. There are some where we have the same pattern is apparent, so where maltreatment correlates strongly with behavioural difficulties. But again, that same systematic review that I talked about before highlights this we call null association between child maltreatment or the witnessing of domestic violence and subsequent antisocial behaviour in those settings. So there were only 3 studies that were identified there, 2 in South Africa, 1 in Brazil, and none show anything more than a weak association. So one of the mechanisms by which childhood adversity is understood to influence criminality is through the experiences of trauma. And this obviously includes some of those types of adversity I've talked about before, but there's clearly also literature around experiences of war, of community violence, of displacement, of serious accidents and injuries, of loss of home and so on, a whole range of different other traumatic events. And again, you can see the stats in front of you, but again, mainly drawn from the US, we can see comparison of estimates of somewhere between a quarter and a half having experienced some sort of, potentially it should really say, traumatic event, and rates as high as 90% in the youth custody populations. And when we look at particularly diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, again, the disparity becomes massive in these US studies. So some, as high as 37% for males and 50% for females being able to be diagnosed in some sense as having post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to this, relatively small general youth population range. And this evidence is mainly drawn from the US, but it's repeated in several countries. So we've got similar studies in Australia, in Russia, and Japan, all of which show comparable rates. But to echo myself again, you've got the narrative here that we still have very limited evidence in other countries, even where we might expect that experiences of traumatic events are much higher. So again, big gaps in the research literature. So that's the first proposition. Obviously, the main thing that we kind of hang this argument on, and I'll return to some of the conclusions and reflections on it later. But I'll leave you just to kind of ponder what this might mean for what we might want our youth justice systems to be doing. If these are the populations that we see so highly prevalent in the youth justice system, what is that youth justice system doing, and how is it engaging these young people, and is it sort of providing the pathway that we might need it to provide for these young people? So the second point that we argue is that experiences of societal marginalisation, of structural disadvantage, of a whole range of forms of inequality influence how these health and developmental determinants are experienced, and therefore in doing so exacerbate the risk of being associated with a criminal justice system. So whilst our first proposition states that health and developmental difficulties have an important influence on trajectories into the criminal justice system, the review also suggests that this risk is greatly amplified where these difficulties occur in the presence of one or more of a variety of social and economic disadvantages. And in turn, that socioeconomic advantage is clearly a very protective factor against criminal justice involvement, even in the context of a whole range of other sorts of difficulties. So, for example, there is very strong evidence from multiple countries that adolescent mental health is highly influenced by various types of social disadvantage and marginalisation, including levels of youth unemployment, experience of discrimination, particularly in relation to racism, neighbourhood deprivation, levels of community support, and experiences of social cohesion. And a systematic review, including studies in the US and Canada and Norway, shows depressed mood or anxiety to be 2.5 times more prevalent among young people with low socioeconomic status than those in higher socioeconomic status. And the evidence would suggest that exposure to disadvantage has a cumulative effect on the kind of psychosocial development that we're talking about here, and therefore on the behaviour that comes with that, with both the kind of the biological and the social mechanisms by which that might happen being kind of increasingly well understood. Similarly, while we know that child maltreatment can clearly occur in all sections of society, it would appear that they're more likely in families experiencing other types of adversity and household stress. And this overlap, again, makes it kind of difficult to unpick the different sorts of relationships and the unique contributions going on here. So, for example, in the World Report of Violence and Health, evidence from countries as kind of geographically and culturally diverse and distinct as Bangladesh and China and Colombia, Egypt, India, Italy, Mexico, Palestine, the Philippines, South Africa, Sweden and the US all show that the potential for child maltreatment is increased when families are affected by low education, low income, domestic violence, or where communities are experiencing a high concentration of poverty and unemployment. A further kind of social factor that we know to be really important in trajectories towards crime is disengagement from education. And again, if we look at that in relation to some of the factors, the health and developmental factors we've talked about, there are clearly some key overlaps and interactions here. So disengagement from education is a particular risk for young people who have unmet needs in relation to specific learning difficulties and functional difficulties. So young people with kind of oral language deficits that might be related to neurodevelopmental disabilities can experience real kind of cumulative challenges in engaging in education as they move through the system. And problem behaviour has been shown to serve as a kind of means to disguise these difficulties as a way in which the challenge in engaging in the classroom really comes out. And unless that underlying cause is understood, then the young person quickly gathers the label of being kind of behaviourally difficult, and that becomes the trajectory on which their needs are understood. So the underlying disability can often be what would be overshadowed or ignored by after that. We also know that social inequality can heighten the risk of neurodevelopmental disabilities. I've said already about FASD being particularly high in Aboriginal communities and irrecoverably linked to kind of broader experiences of extreme disadvantage and discrimination and oppression. And we also know that social factors affect the experience and progression of neurodevelopmental disabilities across the globe. So socioeconomic status clearly affects access to specialist support. It affects the likelihood of you engaging with services. It affects access to services. So, and without that kind of sufficient support in the context of developmental difficulties, we know that these kind of secondary difficulties can emerge. So, as I say, unless these needs are recognised and supported, then cumulatively that developmental difficulty becomes a real challenge for a young person as they move into adolescence. So in short then, the same kind of health and developmental difficulty that I kind of outlined in the first proposition are clearly not experienced the same way by all the young people that have those difficulties. That they might be exacerbated by social disadvantage and that there's an interaction between these things. And again, I invite your reflections on this. You know, what does this mean for how we might think about the systems that I'm concerned with today? So a last proposition, then, this one focuses on the kind of inner workings of the criminal justice system itself. And here we argue that systemic biases in criminal justice practices increase the risk of criminalisation for young people with specific health and developmental difficulties. So you'll all be aware, but exposure to a criminal justice system is clearly not simply a product of an individual's criminal behaviour. We know that it also reflects the practices of the system itself, both in determining whether a particular behaviour is criminal or not, determining which behaviours are criminalised, but also in targeting resources across populations to identify and to process individuals that were involved in those sorts of behaviours. And it's well established that the unequal application of policing and other criminal justice resources leads to a very varied likelihood of criminalisation of different groups or individuals. So if we're going to try and understand the health and developmental determinants of criminal justice system involvement, we need to understand the mechanisms by which certain kind of health-related characteristics might increase these risks of being engaged in the criminal justice system. So here we're concerned with a range of practices. We argue that insufficient professional training and a lack of appropriate assessment and screening tools limit the identification and support of young people with these kind of mental health or developmental difficulties at various stages of the criminal justice system. And this is particularly the case where these needs may be hidden, where they might not be severe but might be kind of mild and moderate, where they're kind of slightly under the radar, or of course where young people have developed some very effective strategies to hide their difficulties, particularly in contexts like this when they're in front of police or people of authority. So generally people that are engaged in the systems that I'm kind of working within are not well trained to understand, and we wouldn't expect them to be, but to understand these kind of health and developmental needs and how to spot them. However, police officers can often play a key kind of gatekeeper role in terms of whether a person, by determining whether a person who has a mental health difficulty or not, and then deciding whether the subsequent response should be referral to a mental health service or into the criminal justice system. So there's a real kind of key decision-making point here about which way things might go. But as I say, police officers aren't routinely provided with training, and again, there might be some good examples here where I know you have a kind of a youth-focused police officers who perhaps counter to what I'm arguing, but generally, and certainly in the UK, we don't have good operational guidelines regarding how to identify or how to respond to mental health needs or developmental needs. Furthermore, we know that there is restricted access to specialist mental health services in many contexts, and that can mean that a criminal justice response might be seen as the only way in which there will be any kind of intervention for this child. So it's seen as being a kind of a necessary evil in terms of getting someone to see this child. So the criminalisation is with the best intentions of supporting a child, but as we would argue, is not really in their long-term interests. There's also research in various kind of Anglophile criminal justice systems that have highlighted disabling processes that increase the risk of criminalisation of young people with neurodevelopmental difficulties, for whom cognitive functioning may not correspond to the levels expected by those systems, or expected even by the age of criminal responsibility in those systems, or therefore to match the kind of inherent assumptions that there might be in those systems about how people can engage and the capacity to engage in a legal process. We know that language and communication difficulties can pose barriers to engaging in forensic interviews that are typically used by the police and during kind of cross-examination in court. So that, that's a challenge for any young person, but you add into the mix any kind of cognitive or communication difficulty, that the kind of the repeat questioning and the attempt to kind of almost trip people up in terms of how they're telling their story clearly poses real challenges. And if unrecognised as being related to communication or executive function or cognition or whatever it might be, then these difficulties appear to be in danger of being interpreted as being attitudinal or behavioural, and that doesn't play out well in front of a judge. So it really could be impacting upon the decision making at different points in that system. We also know that specialist support to address health and developmental needs seems rarely to be available within criminal justice systems. So interventions typically fail to adequately address these underlying difficulties that might be linked to the behaviour, and so they serve in that sense to kind of maintain that behaviour if they don't address it, and the young person's engagement in the system. So it increases the risk of recidivism, increases you being back within that system, at which point you get a higher dosage of the same intervention that's not working, and it fails again, and so on, until we find the young person in their kind of final resting place in the system, which is the custodial environment that I've kind of described as being highly prevalent. And of course, without that kind of specialist intervention, you might actually be exacerbating some of those underlying difficulties. So it's kind of, there's the re-traumatizing that's going on through these systems. There's the impact on mental health and so on. So a final set of reflections there for you, I guess, about the needs of our criminal justice professionals, the needs of our criminal justice systems, and how you as as a health research and practice community might be in a position to inform and to develop here. So just a few conclusions, and then I open it up to you for comment. So we feel that, and again, I'm interested in reflections here, but we feel that the evidence that we have here, if sometimes geographically inconsistent, suggests the existence of important health and developmental determinants of criminal justice involvement in adolescence. And whether these are working as a direct or an indirect cause or influence of conduct problems and delinquency, or a contributory factor to its continuation and its escalation, the range of factors I've presented to you all appear to increase the risk of exposure to criminal justice systems. So this risk then, as I said, is amplified by experiences of social marginalisation and inequality, and by criminal justice processes that seem to discriminate and keep these young people within the system more readily. So that means that significant numbers of young people are therefore left vulnerable to criminal justice involvement due to this kind of toxic combination of health difficulties and social disadvantage. So what does that suggest we should be doing? Clearly there's this weight of evidence calls into question the extent to which adolescent health and developmental difficulties are being appropriately understood, recognised and responded to as early warning signs for possible kind of future criminal justice involvement. It implies a need for earlier identification of these needs through routine assessment of young people, including, we would argue, when behavioural problems are first observed, when a child's at risk of exclusion or disengagement from school, and on the first contact with the criminal justice system. And then likewise, it implies the monitoring of behaviour when these kind of health and developmental difficulties are first observed. And this suggests some challenges for our systems. It suggests stronger information sharing. It suggests easier routes of referral between our health systems, with community mental health services, with family support services, and with schools. And it supports calls for community-based preventative services that target all young people who are at risk. Now, of course, it's easy to argue for earlier intervention. It's more difficult to provide it without kind of real investment, and particularly in the UK, but we're in a context of disinvestment from all of these sorts of services that we're talking about. But there are some shining lights here. We've seen examples in various countries of what we call models of justice reinvestment, and these models, which have actually had their biggest impact in the more right-wing states, argue that we should seek to reduce both the level of crime and the costs associated with current kind of criminal justice processes, particularly incarceration, through the redirection of funds out of the criminal justice system and into other sorts of services. And to date, these sorts of initiatives have been primarily focused on areas where there are high levels of crime, but there's no reason why we can't kind of take that same model and apply it to the context of health and development. I've also clearly argued for reform of criminal justice practices, and this evidence about the extent of health and developmental difficulties among those exposed to the criminal justice system suggests that these systems are the primary service provider for many young people with complex needs. And for many, it's a prison that's providing the care for these kind of complex difficulties. And that, to me, feels entirely inappropriate. The lack of kind of specialist provision also calls into question whether the rights of these young people are being fully upheld, and recognising children engaged in criminal justice systems as children first and offenders second. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child makes it very clear that responses to youth crime have to be governed by principles of welfare and also to a responsiveness to a child's individual needs and circumstances. And it would appear to me that we're really failing to do that. And we can think about how we might affect change in systems, and one way is to be thinking about the principles of therapeutic justice, and we argue that this offers us an approach that embodies the rights, whereby the kind of primary aim of a criminal justice system and any kind of intervention with a young person is to address, and I quote here, the main factors, the roots of what may lead the individual to come into contact with the law. And these may be the sort of factors I've been describing, or they may be economic, they may be social, or more likely a complex combination, but the argument being it's the needs of the young person we need to be concerned with, not their deeds, not the behaviour itself. So it shifts the discourse, therapeutic justice shifts the discourse away from criminality towards kind of vulnerability, towards the kind of the needs that are apparent where a young person is engaging in these sorts of behaviours. And just lastly, an awareness of the processes and practices leading to the kind of potential criminalisation that I've described, we argue gives sufficient impetus for generic reform. So we don't need to be reliant on effective assessments of the needs of the young people coming before a court. If we assume that these stats are accurate, that there are high proportions of young people coming in front of courts that have these developmental needs, why are we not just changing all of our practices so that they assume that, as opposed to awaiting an assessment, a professional assessment of a diagnosis that says we should change our practices for this particular young person? And we would argue that these sorts of generic reforms would actually serve the needs of a whole range of young people, whether they can get to a clinical diagnosis or not. So that's me done. I did just want to end by saying, I am really interested in your critiques, and I won't go through this in detail, but I'm particularly concerned about some of the holes in the data, particularly around the inconsistent geographic evidence and what that means, particularly for the implications that we're describing. What should we be arguing for on a global stage here, as opposed to the slightly high-income country reflections that I feel like I've just had there. And whether there are any kind of particular gaps that, from your experience, you think are screaming out to you in terms of the evidence base that we need to present to the health and justice communities. But as promised, I end with some very genuine questions for you about the New Zealand context. I wonder, because from all the studies I've drawn on, you will have noticed that New Zealand doesn't get mentioned an awful lot in terms of the research. There is the longitudinal studies that you are clearly leading the world on. The studies in a youth justice population, perhaps less so. So I do wonder what you as a health research and clinical community know about the health and developmental profiles of young people in the New Zealand youth justice systems. I wonder how robust the assessment processes and the data sharing that I've just been arguing for plays out in your context. And also similarly, how would your youth justice system respond to these needs if it was identifying them? And how would it respond better? What might the role of you as a community be to address some of the problems that I've raised? So a few tough questions for you, but all reflections welcome. Thank you.